The 7-year-old girl's skull was caved in from the back, her tiny fingers still clutching a handful of berries she'd never get to eat. Kira died on a Tuesday morning in what is now Germany, 40,000 years ago, when a cave bear caught her picking breakfast outside her family's shelter. The berries were still warm in her palm when her mother found her 3 hours later. Her death lasted exactly 4 seconds, but her family would spend the next 6 months slowly starving because Kira had been their best food finder. In the Stone Age, death came faster than modern humans can comprehend, but life moved slower than we can imagine. Kira's people spent 16 hours a day just finding enough calories to survive until tomorrow. They lived in groups of 25 people who knew each other's breathing patterns and could identify family members by the sound of their footsteps in complete darkness. Kira's father Grok woke up that morning the same way he'd woken up for 38 years. His back ached against the mammoth hide that separated his spine from solid rock. His empty stomach cramped so hard it felt like someone was twisting a knife in his gut. His teeth throbbed from the constant grinding that came from chewing roots and raw meat. Before he opened his eyes, he listened. 2 minutes of complete silence while his brain cataloged every sound within a half-mile radius. Rustling leaves told him wind direction and strength. The absence of insect noise would signal danger approaching. Grok's hearing could detect a twig snapping at 300 yards because men who couldn't hear that well had been dead for 20,000 years. His ears were survival computers that never stopped processing data. Safety was a luxury that wouldn't be invented for another 39,000 years. No animal tracks in the mud meant no predators had visited during the night. No disturbed rocks meant no floods had changed the water level. No floating debris meant the stream hadn't been contaminated upstream by a rotting carcass. The walk to the water took 45 minutes for a distance that would take you 3 minutes today. Grok couldn't walk in straight lines because straight lines meant death. He moved from boulder to tree to bush, stopping behind each piece of cover to scan for movement. His eyes could spot a human-sized shape at 600 yards and detect motion at twice that distance. He knew which shadows belonged and which didn't, which leaves moved naturally with wind and which moved because something was hiding behind them. He studied the water like his life depended on it, because it did. Clear water with visible bottom meant safe to drink. Cloudy water meant animal waste upstream. Green tinge meant algae that would make you sick for days. Red tinge meant blood, which meant something had died upstream recently, which meant predators were probably nearby feeding on the carcass. Cave lions hunted at dawn and could cover the distance from the tree line to his position in 12 seconds. Brown bears moved silently through water and could be on top of him before he heard them coming. Even other humans posed a constant threat, because neighboring tribes would kill strangers on sight, rather than risk them discovering food sources. Grok's people died regularly, from diseases that would be trivial. A simple cut could kill you in 5 days through infection. Diarrhea from bad water could dehydrate you to death in 3 days. Tooth infections spread to your brain and killed you. The average lifespan was 28 years, and most of those years hurt. Grok's people needed 4,000 calories per day just to maintain their body weight in the cold. But finding those calories required burning 3,000 calories through physical activity. They lived in a constant state of near starvation that would drive modern humans insane within weeks. Plant foods made up 70% of their diet, but finding plants meant knowing the growth patterns and seasonal availability of over 200 different species. Grok could identify edible roots by the shape of their leaves, locate nut trees by the scatter pattern of their shells, and predict berry ripeness by subtle changes in stem color. This knowledge took 15 years to master and meant the difference between life and death. Hunting provided the fats and proteins necessary for brain development, but hunting meant getting close enough to kill animals that could kill you first. Grok's hunting spear was 6 feet long, with a stone tip that took 8 hours to craft and could only be used once. Missing your throw meant losing your only weapon and facing an angry animal with nothing but your hands. Hunters had to get within 15 feet to guarantee a killing blow, but mammoths could swing their tusks in a 16-foot arc that would slice a man in half. The hunt itself lasted 6 hours, but preparation took 3 weeks. Butchering 8 tons of meat before it spoiled required every member of the tribe working for 48 hours straight. They had to remove the hide, divide the meat into portions that could be carried, extract the bones for tools, and render the fat for winter storage. Working outside for 2 days meant constant vigilance against scavengers who could smell the blood from 5 miles away. Grok's people needed to store 6 months' worth of food because winter hunting was nearly impossible. They dried meat on wooden racks that took weeks to build, collected nuts and roots in quantities that required backbreaking labor to gather, and preserved berries in rendered animal fat that would keep them edible until spring. The winter itself was a slow-motion death march that claimed the weak, the old, and the unlucky. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and their only heat source was fire that had to be maintained 24 hours a day. Going to sleep with a dead fire meant waking up dead. Someone had to stay awake all night feeding wood to the flames, which meant sleep deprivation that lasted for months. Women gave birth alone, except for help from other women who learned everything through trial and error. Half of all children died before age 5, not from dramatic causes, but from simple infections, minor injuries that became infected, or illnesses that would be easily treatable today. Raising children meant constant supervision because children who wandered off died. Kira had been considered old enough at 7 to gather food near the cave, but not old enough to recognize the warning signs of a nearby cave bear. Her death would teach her younger siblings lessons about survival that no modern parent could imagine teaching. Refusing to share during times of plenty meant being refused help during times of scarcity. Fighting within the group meant weakening everyone's chances of survival. The penalties for antisocial behavior were immediate and final because the group couldn't afford to support members who threatened everyone else's survival. When one person got sick, everyone got sick. Respiratory infections killed the weak and left the survivors gasping for weeks. Digestive illnesses from spoiled food could wipe out entire families. Skin infections from cuts and scrapes became systemic infections that killed healthy adults in days. Mental illness was a death sentence because the group couldn't support members who couldn't contribute to survival. Depression meant losing the motivation to find food, which meant starving. Anxiety disorders meant making poor decisions under stress, which meant dying in dangerous situations. Psychotic breaks meant becoming unpredictable and dangerous to the group, which meant exile. Grok's people created art that lasted 40,000 years, developed language complex enough to pass down detailed knowledge across generations, and formed emotional bonds so strong that they risked their lives to save each other. They buried their dead with ceremony, cared for disabled members of their community, and created music that helped them endure the hardest moments of their lives. Handprints on cave walls made by pressing paint-covered hands against stone, creating permanent records of people who lived and died without names. Hunting scenes that document the exact techniques used to kill massive animals with primitive weapons. Family groups gathered around fires, children playing games that prepared them for adult responsibility. A single stone blade required understanding the molecular structure of different rock types, knowing exactly where and how to strike to create sharp edges, and having the hand-eye coordination to execute hundreds of precise strikes without making a single mistake. These tools were so perfectly designed that modern attempts to replicate them often fail. Grok's people needed precise words for different types of snow, wind directions, animal behaviors, plant growth stages, and tool-making technique. Their vocabulary for survival-related concepts was more detailed than modern language because imprecise communication meant death. They could describe the difference between 27 different types of animal tracks and had specific words for the exact moment when meat was perfectly cooked. 25 people lived together for their entire lives, sharing everything and making every decision as a group. They had no privacy, no personal space, and no individual possessions beyond basic tools. Conflicts had to be resolved immediately because holding grudges could destroy the group's ability to function as a survival unit. Grok could remember the exact location of every edible plant within a 10-mile radius, the seasonal movement patterns of dozens of animal species, the face and personality of every human he'd ever met, and hundreds of stories that contained survival information disguised as entertainment. His brain was a living library that contained everything his people knew about staying alive. Flash floods swept away entire camps and everyone in them. Droughts killed the plants and animals they depended on for food. Volcanic eruptions buried valleys under ash and forced entire populations to migrate or die. Navigation happened without maps, compasses, or landmarks that would survive long enough to be reliable. Grok's people found their way across hundreds of miles of wilderness, using the position of stars, the direction of prevailing winds, the migration patterns of birds, and subtle changes in plant life that indicated proximity to water sources. Getting lost meant death, so they developed mental mapping skills that modern GPS can't match. Their understanding of animal behavior was so detailed that they could predict when predators would hunt, where prey animals would graze, and how to approach dangerous animals without triggering their attack responses. They knew that wolves hunted in coordinated packs, but could be scared away by loud noises, that cave bears were nearly blind but had extraordinary hearing, and that saber-toothed cats couldn't climb trees but could leap 20 feet horizontally. Fire wasn't just a tool, it was the difference between civilization and chaos. Creating fire from scratch took hours of careful work that couldn't be rushed or interrupted. They had to gather specific types of wood that would burn cleanly, create tinder from plant materials that would catch sparks easily, and strike flint against steel with exactly the right technique to produce sparks hot enough to ignite their tinder. Losing fire meant starting over from the beginning. which could take an entire day. Stone blades became dull after cutting tough materials and had to be carefully resharpened using techniques that took years to master. Wooden spears cracked from impact and needed repairs that could only be done with specific types of plant glue. Animal hide clothing wore out from constant use and had to be patched using sinew thread that they made themselves from animal tendon. Grok lived with adrenaline levels that would hospitalize modern people, but his body had adapted to function normally in a state of permanent alertness. His sleep was light enough that any unusual sound would wake him instantly, but deep enough that he could recover from the physical exhaustion of survival. His emotional responses were calibrated for life-or-death situations, not the subtle social dynamics that modern humans navigate. Their sense of time was completely different from ours. They thought in terms of seasons, not years, and measured distances by how long it took to walk somewhere, not by abstract units. They had no clocks, no calendars, and no way to schedule activities beyond when the sun is at this position, or during the season when this plant blew. Their entire concept of the future extended only to the next winter, because planning beyond that was pointless when so many things could kill you before then. They saw children killed by accidents, adults killed by diseases, and elderly members of their group simply stop eating and die when they became too weak to contribute. Death was so common that they developed elaborate rituals to process grief and move forward, because stopping to mourn for too long meant dying themselves. Successfully hunting a large animal meant feasting until everyone was completely full, a sensation that many of them experienced only a few times per year. Finding a new grove of fruit trees meant temporary abundance that felt like winning the lottery. Surviving through another winter meant celebrating with the intensity of people who truly understood how close they'd come to dying. They painted animals on cave walls, because those animals represented everything important in their lives: food, danger, beauty, and power. They carved small figurines because creating something permanent gave them a sense of control in a world where everything was temporary. They made music because singing together helped them coordinate work and bond as a survival unit. They buried her small body in the back of the cave, sang the songs that would help her spirit find the afterlife, and then immediately began the work of replacing her contributions to the group's survival. Her mother had to find someone else to help gather berries. Her father had to spend extra time teaching survival skills to Kira's younger sibling. Her death made everyone's life harder, but stopping to grieve properly would have made everyone's life shorter. Climate changes made agriculture possible, which meant reliable food sources, which meant larger populations, which meant specialization of labor, which meant technological advancement, which meant the gradual development of the comfortable modern world where death by cave bear is no longer a daily concern. They survived in conditions that would kill most modern people within days, using nothing but their minds, their bodies, and their ability to work together. They were us, living in a world so dangerous that simply making it through one normal day required more courage, skill, and determination than most modern humans will ever need to display. A child who survived to adulthood had witnessed hundreds of deaths, learned to read weather patterns that could change in minutes, and memorized the behavior patterns of dozens of predators. They knew which plants were poisonous by watching animals die from eating them, which water sources were safe by observing which ones killed the animals that drank from, and how to predict volcanic eruptions by the strange behavior of birds 3 days before the mountain exploded. Territory disputes between neighboring groups weren't settled with words or treaties. When two tribes encountered each other, violence was the default response because sharing resources meant everyone starved. These conflicts were swift and brutal, lasting minutes rather than hours. The losing group either fled immediately or died where they stood. There was no middle ground, no negotiation, no mercy for the defeated. They painted their faces with mud and charcoal to make themselves look more intimidating, practiced group fighting formations until they could coordinate attacks without speaking, and worked themselves into psychological states where killing strangers felt natural rather than horrific. The ability to switch from peaceful food gathering to lethal combat in seconds meant the difference between protecting your family and watching them die. When winter approached, Grok's people had to choose between staying in their current location and risking starvation, or moving to areas with better resources and risking conflict with other tribes who had the same idea. These decisions were made by group consensus, but the consequences fell on everyone equally. A wrong choice meant the entire tribe could die within weeks. Grok could run 30 miles without stopping, climb vertical rock faces using only his fingertips and toes, and carry 100-pound loads across rough terrain for days. His vision could track moving objects at distances that would require binoculars today. His sense of smell could detect smoke from fires 20 miles away and identify different types of animals by their scent trail. Pregnancy meant 9 months of increased vulnerability, while still maintaining full participation in food gathering, defense, and tribal duties. Giving birth in winter meant doing so in sub-zero temperatures with no medical support. Nursing infants required consuming extra calories that the tribe could barely spare, but failing to produce enough milk meant watching your child starve to death. Food preservation techniques required detailed knowledge of biochemistry that these people developed through trial and error over thousands of years. They learned that certain types of smoke would preserve meat for months, that specific salt concentrations would prevent spoilage, and that fermentation could make foods safer to eat while extending their shelf life. A mistake in food preservation could poison the entire tribe, or leave them without stored food during the winter months when hunting was impossible. Leadership wasn't inherited or elected. It emerged naturally from whoever could make the best decisions under pressure. Grok had been following the same leader for 12 years, but that could change instantly if the leader made a mistake that endangered the group. Democracy was a luxury they couldn't afford when wrong decisions meant death. Every story contained survival information disguised as narrative. Which animals were dangerous during which seasons, where to find food during droughts, how to treat injuries with plant medicine, and what signs preceded natural disasters. These stories were the tribe's encyclopedia, medical textbook, and survival manual, all combined into memorable narratives that could be passed down accurately across generations. Grok's people developed the ability to sleep in shifts, with part of their brain always alert to danger signal. Even in the deepest sleep, sudden silence could wake them instantly because predators moving nearby would cause normal night sounds to stop. They slept in physical contact with each other not for comfort, but so they could feel immediately if someone stopped breathing or began having seizures. Every breath you take, every meal you eat, and every night you sleep safely is possible, because people like Grok and Kira spent 40,000 years learning how to stay alive long enough to have children who would continue the species. Their daily nightmare became our daily miracle, and their brutal truth became our comfortable lie that survival is easy and death is optional.